Let's hope this goes well. Not like when Jerry Halliwell left the Spice Girls.
I think I phoned the helpline, actually. There was a helpline set up.
For Jerry Halliwell?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep.
That's something I didn't
my ear up.
know. Hello. This is my first live conference talk in about 3 years. It's so incredibly good to be back in Scotland. It's also really good to be back at DIBI. Last time I was here was in 2010, and I looked exactly the same.
No.
Exactly the same.
Varifocals, no, it wasn't varifocals there.
They weren't varifocals. Thank you for ruining the
Sorry about
illusion.
that. Yeah, no.
All of that. Sadly, I no longer fit into that suit. I'd almost forgotten what it's like to see people in 3 dimensions. I'm certainly a little bit more 3-dimensional than I was the last time I was here. Let's just say that I'm a more rounded person than I was back then. I waited for 30 minutes and no ladies showed up. It's very disappointing. So, I've got to admit that a few years ago, I've been doing this for 25 years now. A few years ago, my interest in web design had completely waned. And looking at what people were making for the web didn't improve my motivation either. Web design seemed to have stagnated. Predictability, I think, had replaced creativity. And for a lot of people, ideas just seemed a lot less important than data. And then I began working with the legendary newspaper and magazine designer, a guy called Mark Porter, who's former creative director at The Guardian and various other important jobs. And I became fascinated by art direction and by editorial design. And as somebody that hadn't studied those things at art school, everything about this aspect of design seemed to be exciting and new. And the more inspired I became by art direction, the faster that my enthusiasm for web design seemed to bounce back. And I'm happy to say that I'm now more inspired and motivated than ever to be designing for the web. So I wrote a book. Coincidentally, it's also called Art Direction for the Web. And I'm going to send a free hardback copy of this book to anybody in the room that's wearing a Motorhead t-shirt. No?
No.
This is very sad. What is that underneath? It's not an acronym for Motorhead. It's DMC or something. No. This is, sorry, mate, this is not going to cut it. So what do you think of when you hear the term art direction? If you've worked in advertising or you've watched a few episodes of Mad Men on TV, you'll have some idea about what an ad agency art director does, or at least did in the 1960s. And at Don Draper's agencies, art directors collaborated with copywriters to develop creative concepts. And they also art directed photo shoots and supervised designers and illustrators. Now, if you ask what art direction means to a bunch of developers, they might answer something like the picture element or the sizes attribute in HTML. For making images responsive or presenting alternative crops or orientations for different screen sizes. Now, these have become really useful tools, but there's more to web design than just using tools. And web designers might mention people like Trent Walton, who sometimes gives his writing its own distinctive images and layouts and typography. And this gets us closer to understanding art direction, but pictures and layout and typography are just the result. they're not its purpose. So if art direction isn't exactly those things, then what is it? One interpretation of mine is that art direction uses design techniques to intentionally evoke an emotional response from someone when they read an article, they use a product, or they visit a website. So I'd like to start with a quote from art director and advertising legend Bill Bernbach. And Bill said, "The truth isn't the truth until people believe you. And they can't believe you if they don't know what you're saying. And they can't know what you're saying if they don't listen to you. And they won't listen to you if you're not interesting. And you won't be interesting unless you say things imaginatively, originally, freshly." Great quote. And saying things imaginatively, originally, and freshly involves art direction as well as it involves design. So this is a talk about art direction, something which has been part of advertising and print design for over 100 years. But on the web, art direction is really rare, and there have been very few meaningful conversations about it. Now, that might be because we've been fixated on designing digital products. It might be because we've become really preoccupied with UX design. Or it could be simply that many designers and developers were never taught about art direction. So I want you to study these two stories for a moment. I'll wait. Why the hell not? Who's going to complain? These are two examples of art directing a news story about the US DEA's longest-running drug cartel case. Now, these pages both contain the same written copy and many of the same photographs. Now, in the first interpretation on the left, this was published by The Atlantic, the information is presented in an intentionally very matter-of-fact manner to make the reader think that The Atlantic is balanced and reliable. Whereas over at ProPublica, these illustrations convey violence with an intensity that would be difficult to stomach if they'd used photography. And these illustrations make people feel tense and terrified. And you know, that's okay, because readers should experience these emotions when they're reading about shootouts and melting drug dealers in acid. And the process of evoking these feelings is called art direction. And these stories were art directed with two very different goals in mind. People pay attention to powerfully art-directed stories. They get noticed. And this story, also from ProPublica, won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. And this story is even more notable because it was written by two journalists. One reported from the woman's perspective, the other from that of the police. And instead of merging these two voices together into one, the editor kept them separate. And the art director, David Slate, recognized that the two timelines and the alternating voices made the story more powerful. So he emphasized the distinctions through his design decisions. Now, the woman's story uses specially commissioned illustrations, whereas the police story includes photography. And her story is told on the left half of the page, and theirs is on the right, with the introduction and the epilogue that are relevant to both placed in the center. And this is a really compelling story, but it's told more emotively because of its art direction. Now, I realise that not everybody designs news stories. Some of us help charities raise money, and we need people to feel an affinity with a cause. Some of us work for governments where the aim is to inform people. Some of us design digital products, and we focus on the experience of using them. Some of us might make websites that sell physical products. So I ask myself how I want somebody to feel when I start art directing every new design. So when art directing their version of the drug cartel story, ProPublica chose a much more dramatic direction because they wanted people to feel appalled while they were reading it. And their choice of Tim McDonough's emotive illustrations helps to stimulate those emotions and shift readers up the emotional scale from being interested to being appalled about what happened. Whereas if, like The Atlantic, they'd chosen a more conventional photo montage, that needle might have moved less. And that's art direction. And as Dan Maul explained, art direction brings clarity and definition to our work. It helps our work convey a specific message to a particular group of people. Art direction combines art and design to evoke a cultural and emotional reaction. Without art direction, we're left with dry, sterile experiences that are easily forgotten. Now, if you're anything like me, whether you're working on a product or a website, you're designing email newsletters, login screens, notifications, onboarding processes, the last thing that you want is for people to feel that your designs are dry and sterile and quickly forgotten. And art direction can prevent that from happening. So, despite what some of you in the audience might think, I'm actually not old enough to remember Alexey Brodovitch's work for Harper's Bazaar magazine from 1934 up until 58. He was born in what is today Belarus and moved to Paris. And in Paris, Brodovitch actually beat Pablo Picasso to first place in a poster competition, of all things. And then he moved to the US to teach design, and he told his students to astonish me. Now, I really, really appreciate his rebellious rejection of anything that he considered mediocre. And Portfolio magazine and Harper's Bazaar became Brodovitch's most well-known projects. And to keep his designs fresh, he frequently worked with other collaborators. He commissioned work from European artists like Jean Cocteau or Marc Chagall or Man Ray. And he had a keen interest in painting. He was a skillful photographer. And he knew instinctively how to combine photographs with written content. And he often turned text into shapes that either contrasted with or mirrored the forms in his photography. And Brodovitch started by designing his layouts as sketches on paper. And these really clearly show how, for him, photography and writing were intimately connected. And I find his layout sketches really informative because I learn much more about how someone thinks by looking at their work in progress rather than looking at the finished result. And then he arranged proof pages on the floor of his studio to direct the reading experience and to create a well-paced magazine. And I really, really appreciate this sentiment of his. The disease of our age is boredom. This is how I felt about the web for a very long time. The way to combat this is surprise. He said, there is no recipe for good layout, despite what I'm going to show you in a minute. And this part resonates with me most. What must be maintained is a feeling of change and contrast. Now, Brodovitch was a master not only of layout but also of pacing. He brought highs and lows, fast and slow movement into his designs, and that can really inspire our interaction designs. Here's someone else. This is a lady called Feitler. She was born in Rio in 1938. And after working on album covers and book designs and magazines, she moved to Manhattan. And in 1961, she was still only 25 at this point, she became one of the youngest and the first female co-art directors at Harper's Bazaar. And on top of everything, she actually once kissed Andy Warhol, which I suppose today's equivalent would be like me kissing Jeremy Keith. It doesn't happen very often. Not something I've done for a while. Jeremy's not here this afternoon, is he? That joke fell flat, didn't it?
You'll have your chance tomorrow, Andy.
Oh, if only I was here.
I know.
So despite her portfolio containing Richard Avedon's famous pink space helmet, there's a naked John Lennon wrapped around a fully clothed Yoko Ono. This was a photograph by Annie Leibovitz for Rolling Stone magazine. Annie Leibovitz once made me a cup of tea. I didn't know at the time what an absolute legend she was. She's been described as the pioneering female art director that you've never heard of. And there's only one book published about her work. It was published in Brazil. It's in Portuguese. And at £250, it's the most expensive book I've ever bought. But it's well worth it. And it's fascinating to see how Feitler respected and then developed Brodovitch's legacy. She understood that magazines should be deliberately and individually constructed, yet at the same time they should be connected to form a harmonious rhythm, just like a website. And she said, a magazine should flow, it should have rhythm. You can't look at one page alone. You have to visualize what comes before and after. Good design is all about creating a harmonic flow. And this could just as easily be describing the web. And she has as much to teach people who design for the web today as she did for magazine designers who followed her. So I hope that in some small way I can help people fall in love with her work like I did. Go off and research her stuff. It's wonderful. And then finally, in the mid-80s, God, is anybody old enough to remember the mid-80s?
Maybe.
Yes. I was obsessed with music, not Duran Duran. I have to say.
You were a rock boy, weren't you? Heavy metal.
That is the case. I was obsessed with music, but it was hard not to know about a magazine called The Face. Come on, you were a subscriber, weren't you?
Iconic.
And I knew that there was something special about this magazine, but at the time I didn't know who Neville Brody was, and I didn't know what an art director did. And The Face maintained punk's rebellious attitude to the establishment. It represented a contemporary pop culture equivalent of the Dada movement, which was opposed to anything remotely bourgeois. And even 25 years after he created these, Brody's pages from The Face magazine, they remain remarkable designs. I'm still inspired by these things every day. But art direction doesn't only happen within the walls of an advertising agency or the pages in a glossy magazine. It can happen every day on the web when we consider how somebody's going to feel when they read our content, they buy something in a store, or they sign up for a product. So these talented art directors, they made work that not only stood the test of time, but it's also become iconic. And I like to wonder sometimes on the web what designs we would find iconic 25 years from today. But it would be really foolish just to mimic work from a previous era or medium. I've seen plenty of people trying to reproduce like jazz posters as in CSS Grid and that kind of thing. Great kind of examples of technical examples, but with no real kind of practical benefit. So what can these people who worked decades ago in advertising and magazine art direction teach us about a modern medium? So I'm going to focus on one small area of how art direction and design can combine to make more appealing and engaging products and websites. And that area is layout. And in particular, something I've written a lot about, which are called compound grids. And these really change the way that I think about layout. And I think they might do the same thing for you. So grids have got a long and varied history in design, from early books through movements like constructivism, international typographic style, right up to the present day in frameworks like Bootstrap or material design. And a generation of product and website designers have grown up with these grids from Bootstrap. Anybody remember the 960 grid system? Before that, anybody even older remember Blueprint? There's some blank faces. You must all be very young. And in frameworks like these, and in plenty of the work that was built on them, grids are mostly used just for aligning content to columns. And when I teach and I ask my students to draw a grid, 9 times out of 10, they'll draw a grid that's got, wait for it, 12 columns of even widths. But there are plenty of often better options. So Karl Gerstner was a Swiss artist, one of the most influential typographers. And he was also one of the first designers to exploit the creative flexibility of using grids. And it's the compound grid that he designed for Capital magazine in 1962, which has become one of his best-known creations. Now, by strange coincidence, I discovered fairly recently that Gerstner's agency also created these ads for a company called Sinar, which is a large format camera company in Switzerland that I actually worked for in the 1990s. And you can see here in these ads that the shape of the word Sinar resembles the results of using swing and tilt movements on a large format camera. And the concept behind Capital was to provide a human view of economics and an economic view of humanity. So the content and Gerstner's design had to be accessible and clear and engaging. And given the potential variety and unpredictability of the content, Gerstner needed to design a grid which would help him lay out the content consistently and without any restrictions. So he designed what he called a mobile grid, which is not the type of mobile that you or I are used to. And this is the grid that you'll most likely find when you're searching online for compound grids. But it's also the one which is likely to baffle people the most on a first look. If you're confused when you see that, so was I. But the compound grid that Gerstner designed for Capital, it looks complicated. So I'm going to explain how he created it and how you can use it by breaking down this grid into its parts and give you some examples about how we might use it. So in this previous grid, you might have seen 58 columns and rows. Not 12, not 16, 58. And you think, that's a lot of lot of column lines that I can use to line things up, but it's much more subtle than that. He started with just one column, and content inside this single module can span the full width of the page. And then he divided that single module into 2 columns and 2 rows to create what is a reassuringly symmetrical layout design. And then that large module can be divided into 3 rows, 3 columns, and you might notice that as we go down, the gutters between these divisions are always the same size. And then by splitting that large module into 4, the columns of content begin to feel formal. And the overall impression is that this design is a serious one. And then when that full page module is divided into 5 columns and then separated into what we call 2 spatial zones by a flow line, this design now starts to feel a lot more technical. And with Gerstner's mobile grid, we can use each set of columns and rows separately. And then we can turn them into a compound grid, either by stacking one on top of the other, or, really interestingly, by overlapping them. So dividing a page up into 6 columns and 6 rows of modules enables us to create this incredible variety of layout options. And it's the flexibility of a compound grid that comes from the interplay of 2 or more grids and how they affect the position and size of elements within a composition. So a compound grid can be made of 2 or more grids of any type. So there might be column grids, which we generally use on the web. They might be modular, symmetrical, asymmetrical, all on one page. And they can occupy separate areas or they can overlap. So if you're still unsure about using modular grids like Karl Gerstner did, you can start by making a compound by overlapping just 2 grids. Maybe one that's got 2 columns and one that's got 3 columns. And by using any number of equally sized columns or rows, as we do when we use let's say a bootstrap 12-column grid, what we create is a rhythm across the page that doesn't change. So just think for a moment about each of those columns in a 12-column grid being a beat. You know, if we tap 12 of them out on the lectern, it doesn't sound particularly inspiring. If we compare that to the grid on the right, we create a rhythm which is 2, 1, 1, 2. And hopefully by then you can understand how using compound grids can create these dynamic rhythms which are going to create much more interesting layouts, but they also change your mental model of how to use grids. So a compound of 2 or 3 grids creates this rhythmic pattern of 2, 1, 1, 2. And then for an altogether different layout, one which uses the space and italic type here to suggest the movement and speed of this Jaguar E-type, I'm going to stagger the stand first intro paragraph and then use text, running text using grid lines from both the 2 and the 3 column grids. And changing the compound formation to maybe combine 3 columns and 4 columns together is going to give us an altogether different rhythmic pattern. This time it's 3, 1, 2, 2, 1, 3. So just with a compound of 2 grids, we might use widths from one grid or the other, or we might combine widths together to form columns which don't really conform to either of those grids. And that same combination can make a very different impression when we combine column widths from both grids to, for example, suggest the width of this column of running text. And the column matches that width of the large vertical image, which balances both sides of the composition. Now this time, I'm going to set the main block of running text across 2 columns, and I'm going to derive their widths by combining column units from 4 and 3 column grids. And those tiny little columns there that are just made up of 1 unit, those things are perfect for informing the size of typographic elements like the drop cap. And overlaying 4 columns with 5 leads to this highly unusual rhythmic pattern. So in this version of the design, this large image shows off the shape of the E-type body. It almost fills the full width of the page. And then we've got a solid block of running text which sits directly underneath that Jaguar's wheels. And that derives its width from the 4-column and the 6-column grid. And then this design puts the E-type right in the center of the action. Text wraps around it on both sides. And this really adds energy to the design. And this is a combination of grids that I tend to use most often because it's flexible enough to handle so many different types of content. And I mostly use FR units when I'm specifying the patterns for these compound grids. So the result of a 2+3 compound is 4 columns, where the width of those 2 outer columns occupies twice the space of the inner 2. And a combination of 3 columns and 4 columns will give you 6 columns, and it will give you that rhythmic pattern of 3, 1, 2, 2, 1, 3. See how different this is in terms of the mental model from thinking about just 12 even columns and lining stuff up. And a combination of 4 and 5 column grids will result in 6 columns, this rhythmic pattern. Unusual, actually. 6, 1, 4, 3, 3, 1, 4, 6. And finally, combining 4 columns and 6 columns creates 8 columns, and 2 of them are much narrower than the rest. And this is a rhythmic pattern of 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2. And that gives us the space within a composition, particularly when we're looking at something like a wide desktop display, which is so reminiscent of a double-page spread in a magazine. So a compound grid might at first look more complex, but it's actually no more difficult to implement than any 8 or 12 column grid. You know, I need ridiculously few HTML elements and no presentational markup to start implementing layouts like this. And the CSS that I need is even more compact, and it's much, much more stable than with older layout tools if you wanted to start making these in floats or display table or anything like that. So when I began to study Brodovitch, I was really drawn to the precision, in particular the way that he brought photographs and text together. And he often cropped photographs in really interesting, unexpected ways, and he placed them sometimes off-center, sometimes they would bleed outside the margins of the page, and this created compositions that were really full of energy. Now, these might first look like a random arrangement of pictures, but he placed them very, very deliberately, and this filled the design with movement. And we can use similar techniques today, even when we're designing flexible, responsive layouts. So I actually used scattered pictures to bring this design for a new electric Vespa to life. And I can arrange these pictures either horizontally or vertically, even diagonally, according to different screen dimensions. And always, to help me design a consistent experience across different screen sizes, I often form a storyboard from a short set of sketches. So for smaller sizes, I might turn that group of images into a little horizontally scrolling panel. And then on medium-sized screens, I'll scatter the images vertically to maintain this visual hierarchy in the portrait orientation. And to develop this design, all I need to use is a combination of CSS Grid and Flexbox and a few CSS transforms. So as you can see, the markup is just incredibly minimal, very meaningful. It's only 3 elements for layout. And to implement this layout, I used a 4+6 compound grid that I showed you earlier. And then I place those elements onto the grid. And then I can reposition them with a media query for the widest screens. And then finally, just to add that extra level of interest and polish, I might nudge and rotate those images to give them that scattered Brodovitch inspired look. Now, sometimes people tell me that designs like this might be appropriate for editorial design, but they're not suitable for products or websites. I don't believe that for a minute. Flexible designs, which include really precisely placed positioning elements, were previously really tricky to implement when we were using CSS floats and positioning. But modern CSS techniques have made implementing these designs much, much more straightforward. And I really hope that these tools are going to result in a new generation of inspired designs. So with this one, which again is inspired by a spread from Brodovitch's portfolio, the second issue, he used a striking combination of black and white columns and then this bold splash of color. So again, I often make a simple storyboard just to demonstrate how elements will flow across a selection of screen sizes. And in particular, the footer, which is the footer on a small screen, but it occupies the whole of the right-hand side of the larger screen. This requires a little bit more styling. So to accomplish that sort of striped column effect, all I'm going to use is a linear gradient on the background image. And then I can use the CSS clip path property, which enables us to clip an element so that only parts of it remain visible. So I position each image, and then I use clip path to clip them so that only a third of each image is going to be visible. And these clipping paths can be any shape, basic circles and ellipses, and they can form these complex polygon shapes with any number of different coordinates. So we can use techniques like this to really create layouts which feel much more organic than just your typical kind of column grids. So I'm going to clip the right-hand side, which only leaves that portion on the left in black. And then I can position the second image absolutely, send it to the bottom of the stacking order. And then that third and final image, I'll just clip the left-hand side, which leaves the portion on the right. And then just as a finishing touch, I'll add an SVG circle and then position that over the top of those images. We might use a mixed blend mode, which will tint the color of the elements that are below it in the stacking order. And this design technique maintains a consistent feel across different screen sizes while remaining fluid and flexible. And since I discovered Brodovitch's work a few years ago, he's been probably the most substantial influence on the work that I am now making for the web. And believe it or not, I do spend most of my time actually designing a cybersecurity product. So you might not think that these two things are related, but there's plenty that we can do in all aspects of design as long as we kind of understand the fundamentals. He made this double-page spread, this widescreen format, his playground. And I like to try to do the same thing. He used this large canvas to carefully construct these compositions, and then used the possibility to contrast and maybe connect both sides of a spread. So this large screen design here splits that viewport into two columns, and it uses color and shape to reflect one half with the other. And all I need is just these three structural elements. There's a heading, a main element, and an aside. So on small screens, all I need is what I call foundation styles for color and typography, because the normal flow will order the content. And then for medium-sized screens, I will apply some grid properties to those main and aside elements so that I can position their content. And then for larger screens, I'm just going to take those main and aside elements onto the grid, two up, using these named lines. And I really think that it's Brodovitch's inability to accept anything mediocre which has been pushing me to think beyond what's expected from product and website design. And I think that with a little inspiration and a bit of imagination, we can all make more distinctive and engaging designs. So, I do hope that you're maybe as excited about art direction on the web as I am, whether you make designs for businesses or charities, governments, news outlets, and you want to tell stories more effectively. You've got everything that you need to make great art direction for the web. And I think that art direction should be as much a part of product and website design as accessibility and performance. Because like them, art direction needn't be someone's specific job. It should be something which everybody is involved in the planning and design and development of. And the role of an art director, plays is something that should be done by everyone. Graphic designers or product designers, UX designers, web designers, all of these people should art direct. Even product marketers can art direct too. Even the CEO can influence art direction when they're thinking about the strategies which are concerned with how people feel about the experience of using a product or a website. So the question is, do I need to convince my boss or my clients that art direction is something that we should be taking seriously? My answer is no. Just get on with it. Just do it. Start bringing art direction into the things that we design and develop every day, and people are going to start noticing the difference. So, there's the book. I'll send a free hardback copy to anybody in the room who is wearing an Iron Maiden t-shirt. You are not wearing an I will send you one anyway. But seriously, you need to reevaluate your life choices. I hope you had a fantastic first day. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Do you want to sit for two minutes? Have a quick thing and then sit down? Right, fine. Right, 5 minutes, and then we're gone. Okay, I had it written down as no Q&A, but let's just do 5 minutes, Andy.
No, we're fine.
We're fine. Have a seat. Thank you so much for that. I love Annie Leibovitz. She is my absolute favourite photographer in the world. Just incredible. Amazing.
Many years ago, and I think this would be about 89, I was working in
A lot of these people won't be born, I'm sadly.
No, I know.
Oh my God, okay.
Who was born after 1989?
Oh no, not me.
Oh, please.
Oh God, that's half the room. Okay.
Yeah.
It's all right.
I was actually working in a photographic studio, and I was working, I had to deliver, I was straight out of college, and I had to deliver a bunch of lighting equipment to a studio, where Annie Leibovitz was shooting. And half the stuff didn't turn up. Half the stuff was missing, so we had to get a load more. And she was so gracious. There was all these people on set waiting to start the shoot and half the stuff missing. And she obviously took pity on me and said, would you like a cup of tea? And she made me a cup of tea while a cab brought the rest of the stuff together. I'll always remember that.
The legend. Yeah, beautiful stuff. Talking about art direction, you were saying for everyone to get involved. What, for you, are the most important ingredients for that? What would your starting point be? You touched on it. You said you want to think of how people feel, but what are the ingredients that you need for powerful art direction?
That's a good question. I think it comes down to thoughtfulness. Mm-hmm. And in a lot of ways, it is aligned with user experience design or customer experience design, something like that. You really want to be thinking about how do we want somebody to feel at this specific moment in their customer journey? And then rather than just kind of leave it there on a post-it note on the whiteboard, actually think about, well, how can we use design techniques, whether it would be color theory or typography or layout tools or whatever, to really kind of evoke that feeling in people. And I know that that's tricky. Particularly, we had conversations earlier on about how does kind of creative design, who asked how does creative design work with things like design systems? There was somebody in the room that asked that question. And that has been a massive challenge for a lot of organizations because things need to be predictable and repeatable and all this kind of stuff. And we build systems and we use frameworks, etc. And the real challenge, whether it's a product or a news outlet or whatever, is how can we create a system that allows for that flexibility on top? And very, very, very few organizations have managed to succeed at that. ProPublica is probably one of the only ones. The Guardian have done a good job, the New York Times also. So, you've got your kind of fundamentals of design of the grid and the typography styles, etc. But then how can we allow people to build on top of that to create the type of design which is going to make people feel in the way that we want?
We're talking about images a lot as well in your talk, and it's something that interests me. I think that some of the most powerful images have been recently in the Ukraine war, and some newspapers have just had the confidence and the knowledge just to go, let's just illustrate it with one photo. So their front page has been one photo. I had two war photographers on one of my programs last week. One of them was just back from Afghanistan. But we're also talking about, do you get to the danger where people become desensitized? So some of the images we saw there are iconic and powerful, but we are being bombarded with images all the time. Do you think there is a danger that we become desensitized to images?
I think there's a danger that we become desensitized to anything in large quantities. I mean, how many people, hopefully nobody in this room, but how many people's families would just say, I want to get Brexit done, right? 'Cause I'm sick of hearing about it. When we're exposed to so much stimuli, and these things constantly, 24 hours a day, there's a danger for everything to become oversaturated. That doesn't mean that we should not use those things, but again, it comes down to thoughtfulness. Yeah. Now, if you were to use a very large image on the front page of a newspaper every single day, then at some point people will start stopping paying attention to it. And that's exactly the same thing with our, our website designs and some aspects of product design too. If everything is that monotonous rhythm where every page is the same. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we don't put navigation in a place where people want to find it. If we have to hunt around the page to find the search box or the checkout button or whatever, then that's not good design, right? But, there are balances. But if everything is just the same, if every website that we visit, every e-commerce store, looks exactly the same, then that's exactly the same kind of desensitization, if that's even a word, that I think you're talking about.
Yeah. Just finally, you mentioned which designs that we have at the moment that we're finding perhaps online in the digital world, do you think will be iconic in 25 years' time when we look back? Which ones will go down in history as being iconic, do you think?
Well, it might surprise you, but I would probably say something like the Google search page, the initial Google search page. I mean, I know that's changed over the years and they've buggered about with it and whatever, but that very kind of iconic central logo search thing, I think is really interesting. I don't know. A lot of it is subjective. I bought I've still got one of the very, very first books that I bought about web design when I didn't kind of do it by. Anybody heard of Jacob Nielsen? He did a book. If you can find this on eBay for 50p, I really suggest you buy this book. It was called Home Pages Redesigned or something like that. I can't remember what it was now. And what he did was there was about 20 or 30 different website homepages from the late 90s. And he would then kind of critique the UX on each of those things. And I've still got that book, and I still look at it sometimes thinking, bloody hell. We used to design stuff like that. No. And actually, you look back on some things, you look back on, the Disney homepage, and no, it might not have been the most inspiring, it might not been the most usable thing in the world, but at least they were trying and experimenting with the medium at that time. Yeah. And, it wasn't just a photocopy of every other website that we see.
Good answer. We have sadly run out of time. It's been a cracking day. It's been fascinating. I'm going to process it all in my head tonight. But I just want to thank you guys for your engagement today, and the talks and the speeches and the questions have been fantastic. A massive thank you to today's speakers: Mark Boyce-Smith, unfortunately Mark had to go back down to York, Graham McDonnell, Helle Jansen, Poppy Reid, Julian Brown, Elon Kuriati, James Taberner, Johnny Grubin, and of course Andy Clarke. Now, we're back here. Hopefully most of you will be back tomorrow. If you don't know Edinburgh, it is a beautiful city. Edinburgh is one of my favourite cities in the whole world. If you're going out, it's nice round here, round the Haymarket. The Royal Mile is just an absolute must. There's great pubs down there. Grassmarket's good. The St James's Centre, I think, is open till 8. It's got nice pubs, it's got shops, and go out and enjoy yourselves. And come back here. If you've got a hangover, I would say Iron Brew is amazing.
Oh, yes.
Have a can of Iron Brew, and we'll be back to smash it tomorrow. So thank you so much for today, and thank you to Andy.